Welcome to Webcertain TV. I'm joined now by Martin Splitt, who's a Webmaster Trends Analyst at Google, and we're going to talk about one of the favourite topics of all SEOs, performance. Hi Martin, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me here.
So why is web performance always on conference agendas, always being discussed? Why is it so important?
Because it matters. No matter what your site is, how large, how big, if it's international, if it's local, performance matters because you don't control the client's devices and network speed. So you want to make sure to be as defensive as possible and do definitely test as early as possible and as often as possible as well.
So what are the biggest challenges or biggest problems that occur that can really impact performance and speed?
Right. So I think the biggest problem I've seen so far is that people haven't been putting a focus on this kind of topic and testing performance in real world conditions as early as possible in their project plan. Because it's similar to building a building, to constructing a building. If you see a problem in a floor plan, you literally can just scratch something out or make a note or something. It's cheap, it's fast, it's easy.
Yeah.
The later you do it, once the concrete has been poured and the building has been erected, it's really expensive and hard to make these changes. So the later you discover problems, the harder it's going to be to actually make a solution happen.
Yeah.
It's going to be more expensive, it's going to take more time, you're going to be fighting business, you're going to be fighting development teams. Test early, test often, that's the biggest thing, I think.
And how should you test? Like, what are the kind of key tests you should run, or what tools should you use, or how is the best approach?
So the best approach is probably if you test like manually, if you have your developers or some like product manager test the product or the website, you should definitely test on a real phone, not on any simulators, not on the Wi-Fi. Get a cheap prepaid SIM card, put it in, use a real phone, and then you see the struggle. You see how annoying it is, how tiny some tap targets are, you see how choppy the navigation works. You catch all these problems that you might not catch testing on a computer with a mobile simulator. So that's the important one. Do not test on the latest iPhone. It's great that you have a latest Pixel or iPhone or whatever. People don't, right? There's an average phone out there. I think for the German market, Bartosz had a talk about it. I think it's the Samsung A5 or something, and depending on which country you're in, that might differ.
Yeah.
Check your Google Analytics. What's the lowest phone that you can find that is not only like one person coming to your website, and then test on these devices. It's good to test often. You can't always manually test on a phone. So using things like Lighthouse or web page test, integrate that into your workflows so that you can do some automatic testing. Look at performance budgets. That's a great technique to like figure out how you're doing against a performance budget. But definitely pay attention to this and do this as often as possible.
And then you mentioned there, the challenges of getting business, developers, etc. on board. This is one of the biggest problems also, is that it's not just a single team project, it's multiple. So what arguments, what kind of approach should you use when talking to the business and people who know nothing about it, and also to developers who have got their own agenda and their own work?
So the problem there is that the motivations might be quite different. So if you talk to developers, you can probably get them by saying like, look at your Lighthouse score, look at the issues that you see in the timeline when you profile in the timeline. That means nothing to the business side. If you can attach a cost to it though, and you can, right? There's like, what does my site cost? And there's other websites that tell you how much it literally costs to load your website. And you can also pin down how much conversion you lose because of the additional time that it takes to load. So you can use these factors to talk to business and show them like, look, this is how much we draw in. We spend this much on marketing. This is how many people we draw in, and this is how many people drop off because of the performance. Yeah. This is the money that we lose. We spent money, and now we lose. Like, we spend this money for nothing because the people come and don't convert, and we lose the money from the conversions on top of that. So that's an argument. Might not work with developers, but if you reassure or if you connect with web developers' desire to create something that works for as many people as possible, that's the reason why you are on the web. Everyone has a browser. Not everyone has an iPhone. Not everyone has an Android phone. But the web is pretty much everywhere. And if it's done right, performance helps you make that accessible for other devices and low-end devices and devices in not as great connectivity situations. Now, obviously, you have to be pragmatic, so don't say like, oh yeah, our analytics show or this statistic shows. That's not going to connect with developers. Show them, here's the phone, try using our website. And they're going to be...
Give them a problem to solve, and they
exactly, and they'll be like, I hate this. I built this, I need to make this better. That's a much, much better approach. And gets me every time.
Yeah, I think that is exactly that. There's a problem here, can you fix it? And it's a challenge then, isn't it?
Yes.
So obviously that's kind of how to get people on board. It's the testing part of it. But what should you do as a starting point? What should the things you should be building in from the very start before you even test, so you don't have to eliminate what you have to fix?
So the web is great and it's a very flourishing platform. The problem also, or the challenge is with that comes a lot of possibility, and not everything that we can do is a great thing that we should do.
Yeah.
Right? So if you build websites, especially in e-commerce or news publishing, you want to make sure that the content is there as quickly as possible, and that it works as robust as possible, especially if you're on a train or in a public area where there's lots of people using the mobile internet together with you, or if you're in a more rural area commuting into the city, you might not have great connection, it might be flaky. So you want to make sure that the content gets there as quick as possible, and then also displays. Nothing is more frustrating than seeing something flash for a second and then it's gone, and then you're like, okay, now my connection broke and now I can't, but it was here a second ago. Why is it gone now? So make sure that you look into it from an architecture perspective as well. Client-side rendering is pretty much the go-to architecture these days because that's what all the JavaScript frameworks do out of the box. But we have better tooling, and we have an agreement across the board that things like server-side rendering and hybrid rendering are much better alternatives because they get the content in as quick as possible. And then with hybrid rendering, the JavaScript becomes more or less, not exactly optional, but it becomes an addition on top of it, an enhancement rather than the most critical single point of failure. So you can get performance benefits as well as usability and user experience benefits from using that. It does require a lot of changes, and it's probably easier to do this in a greenfield project where you start from scratch rather than migrating from something that you've got. But it is definitely worth looking into, and there's plenty of frameworks, so-called higher level frameworks. If you're using React, you can use Next.js, which brings hybrid rendering out of the box. If you are using Angular, you can use Angular Universal. If you're using Vue, there's Nuxt.js, which is inspired from Next.js. So you have options to look into, and I think not enough people are looking into them right now.
And you've mentioned JavaScript there, and that's a topic that is talked about quite a lot now. There's some debate as to when it should be used and how it should be used. What is your kind of advice on how and when to implement JavaScript? So
JavaScript is a great technology if you build more complex web apps. And that can be an online shop. It depends on what you're trying to build. If you have, let's say, an online community with a built-in shop and it's about the community aspects, then you can use JavaScript as your technology foundation to manage and work within a very complex flow of interactions and state management. And JavaScript makes perfect sense there. If it's a landing page, I'm not so sure why you would go with JavaScript straight away. There's fantastic ways of not doing that. Static site generators are viable tools to make websites when they're static. You don't need JavaScript for that. You can always enhance static websites with JavaScript, that's okay, but the critical content is there right away. If you have something that requires more interactions, then definitely look into, again, hybrid rendering to get the best of both worlds. But pretty much, JavaScript isn't bad per se. It allows us to do things that we weren't able to do before. It is part of the web platform. It's not going to go away. It's not a magical fad that it's going to disappear eventually. And unlike Flash or Java, it does integrate into it's a part of the web platform. It's not something that is like flanged onto it. It's an integral part of it. So I would say try to get away with as few JavaScript as possible. Don't do everything in JavaScript just because that's the way that everyone does it. But do acknowledge and understand that JavaScript is an integral part of it and learn how to use it correctly That's a very important part.
So what is the advice on the best way to, if you're starting off with a new site, what would be the recommendation for the, the best, most simple way, I suppose, to do it that works for developers, works for the business, works for SEO?
Right. That depends on what you're trying to build. Again, if it's something that is highly interactive, look into the frameworks, but look into the frameworks from a perspective of how does this look like if JavaScript is not available? How does this look like if the JavaScript somehow cannot be downloaded correctly? Yeah. Do I get a blank page? That's a bad thing. That's not a good thing to have. Does it not use JavaScript at all? Well, then it's not very dynamic. So I'm not sure if that's necessarily state of the art and great. But it depends on what you're trying to build, and then you have to choose from the tools that are available. Is this a static site generator thing? Is this something that I want to tackle with a server-side content management system like WordPress or Typo3 or Drupal or Joomla or whatever? Or is this something where I want to build an app kind of thing, a web app, something that's highly interactive? Then JavaScript frameworks are a good choice. And you have to pick from this, and you can mix and match these as well. You can have part of your website served from a static site generator, and then you tap on a link that takes you to some other part of your website, and that's a JavaScript app that uses hybrid rendering. So definitely look into the requirements analysis with your developers. Don't just like make a package and then tell developers, now build it.
Yeah.
Have a conversation from the get-go. And also when the developers evaluate the tools that they want to use, ask them, does this mean that we require Java? What would happen if the JavaScript download would fail halfway through? What would the users see?
Yeah.
Right? A badly layouted news article or a blank page?
Yeah. Yeah. And that comes back to testing as well, doesn't it?
Yes.
If you are going to use that approach, you need to test at every stage of the development to make sure that, so that if it's not going to work, you need to step back a bit.
Identify that early and back up a little bit.
Go in a different way. Aside from the kind of JavaScript and the language side of it all, what are any other tips you've got? Any other areas that really, from a performance perspective, are really important and perhaps overlooked a little bit?
There's a lot of image optimization that you can do, especially when it comes to perceived performance. There's these, you've probably seen them on, I think Medium does it, I think a few other websites do it as well, where you get a blurry image right away and then it like starts improving. Mozilla has done amazing work with JPEG. They have their own Mozilla JPEG thing. Some Google developers built a website called Squoosh.app, and I highly recommend that. That lets you drag and drop an image and then like play around with the settings. You see how large it's going to be after the optimization and how it's going to look like. So that you definitely can do a lot of stuff with CSS and image optimization to get a faster perceived performance. That's not necessarily gonna, if the image comes out smaller, that's great, then you definitely save time. But even if you don't want to sacrifice the bits and bytes because you need high definition imagery, you can still get a better perceived performance by just getting the right settings in there.
Great. Well,
thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing all of that.
Has been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks.